I'd like to call the meeting to order. We'll welcome everyone to the fiscal year 19 budget cycle, the first meeting of it. I'd like to make note that Garrett won't be joining us for this budget cycle. He had to resign due to work commitments and being unable to meet the budget committee timeline and the meetings. We're going to be discussing the proposed budget for fiscal year 19. But before we get through that, let's go ahead and invite our city attorney up to talk about public election law. Thanks.
Hi, good evening. Catherine Brotherton, City Attorney. There's 5 minutes on the agenda for me, but I think I can knock this out pretty quick. A couple minutes. I was asked just to give a quick reminder about elections law and how that could and does impact a discussion you would want to have tonight. The good news is you can disregard this starting next week because it applies right up until the election. So it really is about the fact we've got there's 4 city measures on the ballot, and the elections law, a specific state statute, prohibits the use of public funds and public resources for any sort of explanation or endorsement or opposition to any of those measures. And so resources includes staff time, public space, any of those things. So what that means is for our city staff and for the citizen members of the budget committee that they come under that rubric of not being able to have those discussions. The council is in a slightly uniquer position because they're elected officials, and so they can, but it makes it a little awkward when those discussions are held when half of your body can't have those discussions. And so for purposes of this evening, if you can not ask questions of staff and not discuss the 4 elections measure, boy, that'll make it go a lot easier. There's any questions? All right, thanks.
Okay, next on the agenda, we have the city manager with the proposed budget and strategic investments. Following his presentation, we'll take a break and then we'll enter into the round robin. Just initial comments about the proposed budget before moving into the queue. So without further ado.
Thank you, Scott. I noticed on the agenda I have 60 minutes and I should be able to finish up in probably an hour and 47 minutes. So the break will be much needed at that point. Feels like we were just here. It feels very familiar. The time has gone really quickly. What I would like to remind folks, particularly those that are new to the budget committee or haven't been on it too long, we do have budget buddies, execs that are willing to sit down with each of you as much as you want as we go through this budget process. We know that there's a lot of material. You may have questions that you don't see answered here, or you're not quite sure of something in particular, and so please feel free to reach out to your budget buddies and connect with them as we work through that. From our perspective, just the more information that you have, the more familiar you are with the budget and how it works is actually really helpful for us as well. So I just want to extend that to you. What I am happy to report is that our overall budget is stable. We are living within our means. The proposed budget increases over last year are less than inflation, and we continue to strategically invest in community and council priorities. 8 years ago, EWEB adopted a community-developed master plan for the riverfront properties redevelopment. And then 3 years later, the city adopted the plan and embedded the vision within its development code. And last month, the city purchased that riverfront property from EWEB, marking a major milestone for EWEB's for Eugene's redevelopment efforts. As promising as this is and what the riverfront redevelopment represents for the community and the city, I'd also like to just remind us of where we were, what we were facing 8 years ago. We had a general fund budget gap of $30 million that needed to be filled, as well as the national economy and a housing market on the verge of collapse. But since that time, with a lot of hard work through the budget committee and the staff and the council and the community, we adjusted our suite of services to fit the needs of the community, align those services with the resources that are available, and continue to thrive as a community. And due to all of that hard work, we are well positioned to continue on an upward trajectory by following a thoughtful, disciplined approach to our decision making and our fiscal management as we've done throughout the years. Tonight I'll walk through the details of the FY19 budget, but I'd also like to discuss how our strategic budget decisions fit within our ongoing efforts over the past few years. As next year's budget moves us forward in a number of council and community priorities, we are fortunate to be able to keep investing in services for the community. But we are still not in a position to make significant ongoing spending commitments. As you know, we are in a better position than forecasted last year at this time, but we still aren't flush with money and for new ongoing programs and services. And this is really the budget environment in which we work, and I'll just talk about a couple of these because they've really served us well over the last 10 years. And these are the primary inputs that drive the budget process. And our guiding philosophy, particularly for those that have been here for this entire time, is really of balancing community service, employee satisfaction, and financial stewardship. And this balance and this guiding philosophy has served us very well through the recession and beyond. And our budget principles have consistently been, we want to have a balanced approach. That's in balancing those philosophical philosophies. It's also balancing services as we move forward. It's always about living within our means. And when we talk about living within our means, that's that our revenues exceed our expenditures on a year-to-year basis and over the forecast period. So that's an important part for us. You'll remember the mantra that we have used throughout the time is only using one-time revenues for one-time expenditures. The corollary of that is not to use one-time monies for ongoing expenses. And you'll probably hear that several times through the next many weeks. We also have said it's really important to maintain a responsible and reasonable reserve level. And the reason why we like to do that, it allows us to anticipate, allows us to be thoughtful in as we anticipate future challenges for us within the budget. And that also allows us to avoid overcorrection. And so as the year-to-year fluctuations in our financial situations occur, if we didn't have a reasonable reserve level, then we could have a tendency to overcorrect. And this allows us to be thoughtful as we move forward. And of course, the community values and the council goals continue to provide the foundation upon which we build our budget. Last year, the Budget Committee recommended and the Council approved funding to implement a budget transparency website. We've sent out that link. I know many of you had a chance to take a look at that. And we believe this is a great tool for the Budget Committee, the Council, the staff, and the community to more easily understand the city's resources and how we spend the money that they invest with us. And we will continue to make improvements to this particular website as we go to provide even better information for people as we move forward. But if you've had a chance to explore through it, I think you'll agree that there's a lot of great information in there, and you can drill down into any one of these areas by department and services throughout that website. This just happens to be one of the snapshots off the website. And our total FY proposed budget is $604.8 million, which is an increase of only 2.3% from the FY18 adopted budget. There's a couple of things just to note, and we'll get into more detail as we move forward with this. But the operating portion of our budget, which is really those things that most people think about when they think about our budget, that's the nuts and bolts that's actually on the ground doing the work. It makes up almost 60% of the budget, and that's up just 1.9% over last year's adopted budget. The capital budget, which represents just under 7% of our total budget, and those are the actual projects, the physical infrastructure that gets built. It's actually down a little over 2% this year, but the largest portion of that is transportation projects, which I'll talk about in a minute, and we'll talk a little bit about why the capital budget's down a little bit in the next slide. And then just as a reminder, the non-departmental piece always looks really big on these charts, but those are the kinds of things which are reserve balances that are available. They're unobligated ending fund balance, they're interfund transfers and loans, they're miscellaneous fiscal transactions, they're intergovernmental pass-throughs. So you have this whole basket of these miscellaneous kinds of things that go into that particular portion of the budget. This also is a screenshot off of that new website. And this is the capital budget module on the home page of the new open budget website. And as you can tell, and if you have a chance to drill down, it has project-specific details for the FY19 capital project list. It has maps and also links to the CIP report, which people can get a lot more information. The proposed FY19 budget for new capital projects is almost $41 million. As an increase of 3.2 million, or decrease of 3.2 million from the FY18 adopted budget, and that's primarily because of a decrease in lower capital spending in the airport fund. As I mentioned earlier, transportation comprises the largest portion of the capital budget. And this includes spending from the street bonds, the pavement preservation program, which is funded by the local gas tax, and spending on the railroad quiet zone. Funding for the railroad quiet zone is $5 million in FY19. This has been approved by the City Council and includes $3.7 million from the Riverfront Urban Renewal District and $1.3 million from the Road Fund. Both of those Council had directed us to include in this year's budget. I'm going to give a quick status overview of a couple of the funds and to explain them in a little bit more detail. We are stable but in a cautionary mode with the general fund for a number of reasons that Mauricio will speak to more in a few minutes, having to do with future challenges like increasing PERS costs and also potential threats to some of our revenues that we've sent out to the Budget Committee over the last several months. The ambulance transport fund is in a cautionary status because federally administered health programs are expected to continue decreasing reimbursement rates as well as decreasing what is considered a covered service. And additionally, the ambulance service system was expanded last year and this year, and covered and non-covered services are increasing, and costs of providing services are expected to continue to increase above reimbursed levels. Essentially what all that means is that we continue to have more work in the fund to be doing. The amount that you can get reimbursed for each one of those responses essentially is less, and so you do more work at less reimbursement, and so the gap just continues to grow for that. The construction and housing fund is stable, primarily because of a strong reserves that we've experienced with the student housing boom over the last couple of years. Residential construction has remained steady and is expected to continue through FY19. Building permit valuation is projected to increase 1% both for this year and 1% in FY19. The Public Safety Answering Point Fund is in a red status, and these are the monies that account for operations of our 911 call taking in the Emergency Dispatch Center. Revenues are received from the state telephone excise taxes. Future revenues are expected to decrease in the out years of the forecast due to decreased subscribers and devices. At the same time, expenditure growth that's outpacing revenues and changing technology will require new equipment and additional technical staff. The fund is operating at a deficit in FY18, and it's challenged because there are state statutory limitations on the revenues, including a flat amount charged per line. And this is a statewide issue, and it's not unique just to Eugene. To keep the fund solvent in FY19, we're proposing a transfer of $300,000 from the general fund. Mauricio will now give us a little bit more detail on some of our revenues and expenditures, and then I'll be back to talk a little bit more about the FY19 budget in detail.
All right, thanks, John. Hi, everyone. My name is Mauricio Badalico. I'm a senior financial analyst here in the finance division. I'm going to walk us through the general fund forecast. But before I dive into the forecast, I want to show you another screenshot here from our new open budget website that shows the general fund main subfund in the FY19 proposed budget. Please note these numbers are a little bit different than the general fund information in the budget summary of your budget documents because it's only for the main subfund and does not include the other two subfunds that make up the general fund. So for the remainder of my presentation, I'll be focusing on the main subfund of the general fund. Overall, the FY19 proposed budget for the main subfund is 2.9% higher than the FY18 adopted budget after adjusting for the reserve for encumbrance. So the city prepares a 6-year financial forecast for the general fund. This is a planning tool that projects our financial condition based on what we know at a point in time. The forecast helps us make a projection about how much the city will spend and receive over the next 6 years based on what we know today. Of course, as we move to the out years of the forecast period, there is less certainty in the assumptions that we use. Staff and the executive team use the forecast to understand the long-term impact of the decisions we make today and to model how potential choices may impact the organization's fiscal health in the future. We update the forecast each fall at the start of budget preparation and again when the city manager presents his budget to the budget committee each spring. Between the fall and spring, we regularly monitor the elements that impact the forecast so that if we need to adjust course, we can do so in a timely manner. And while there are hundreds of variables that affect the forecast, swings in key variables such as property taxes and inflation can have a greater impact on our financial health. We also use the forecast as we monitor two important financial goals that John has mentioned. One, are we living within our means? And two, do we have an adequate savings account? Here are some of the key general fund revenue sources that affect the forecast. Ground Emergency Medical Transport, or GEMT, was enacted in 2016, allowing first responders to receive payments for a percentage of their work in preparation for transport of Medicaid patients. GEMT was originally expected to generate $925,000 in ongoing reimbursements starting in FY18, but that has not occurred due to delays in adopting the rules and processes for the program. The current forecast includes no GEMT revenue in 18 and 19 and a reduced ongoing amount of $400,000 in FY20. State shared revenues result from the sale of cigarettes, alcoholic beverages, and more recently marijuana. State share revenues from alcohol have been reduced from previous forecast estimates based on a recommendation from the League of Oregon Cities. They recommended that cities forecast conservatively because the Oregon Liquor Control Commission had not updated their alcoholic beverage projections for quite some time. For the other key sources of revenue that you see here, we're going to be taking a closer look over the next few slides. Here's a summary of general fund revenue over the last few years. The blue bars in this chart represent total general fund revenue. The spike you see in FY16 is due to the one-time funds from the Comcast legal settlement. Excluding this one-time revenue source, the estimated average annual increase over the period shown here is 3.4%. The red line in this chart represents property tax collections in the general fund, which includes both current and delinquent payments. Property taxes are the largest revenue source in the general fund, projected to be around 65% of total revenue in the current fiscal year. Now let's take a closer look at property taxes. This chart shows the annual change in the city's taxable assessed value over time. On the left, in the years leading up to the recession, the average annual change was 4.4%. This dropped to 2.2% during the recession and has since recovered to an average of 4.2% through FY18. This fall, we received some good news from the tax assessor when we learned that the city's certified taxable assessed value for FY18 increased more than we had projected in the previous forecast last spring. We had previously projected 3.8% growth in FY18 and all subsequent years of the forecast. However, the actual growth rate for FY18 came in at 4.4%. After analyzing recent trends in taxable building permit activity, The projected growth rate in the current forecast for FY19 and beyond has been increased to 4%. This falls within the range we have seen since coming out of the recession. And to put these percentages in perspective, a 1% change in taxable assessed value currently equates to about $1 million in general fund revenue. Using FY18 as an example, the certified value increased 4.4%, while we had projected just 3.8%. That's a difference of 0.6%. And that difference of 0.6% results in approximately $600,000 of additional revenue for the general fund in FY18. This chart shows 3 possible scenarios for property tax revenue projections over the forecast period based on different growth rates of taxable assessed value. The blue solid line in the middle is what's included in the current FY19 proposed budget forecast, and the other 2 dashed lines represent more optimistic and pessimistic taxable assessed value growth rates. So if you look to the left at FY19, the difference between those lines is approximately $500,000, but that amount grows in the out years of the forecast to a difference of about $3.6 million. The next largest revenue source in the general fund after property taxes is a contribution in lieu of taxes, or SILT, from EWEB. This consists of 6% of EWEB's electric retail sales revenue and a fixed component that adjusts annually based on inflation. The primary drivers that impact the amount of SILT we receive include the changes in the retail price of electricity and the amount of electricity consumed, which is influenced by weather patterns. SILT revenue is down in the FY19 proposed budget forecast when compared to last year's adopted budget forecast. This is due to a change in EWEB's rate assumptions as they continue to implement cost-cutting measures. In the absence of electric price increases in the near term, SILT revenue is projected to remain relatively flat through FY19, with modest increases beyond that. Now let's look at revenue from Comcast right-of-way fees. As you may recall, the Comcast legal settlement included 2 components. The first component was a one-time payment to cover unpaid right-of-way fees from prior years. The second component is an ongoing payment equal to 7% of gross revenue from internet services using the city's right-of-way. The ongoing payment was originally anticipated to be about $1 million per year, but this has since been increased to $2.2 million starting in FY18. This increase is based on experience with actual receipts from this new revenue source. On a related note, there's an issue with the FCC that has the potential of impacting the city's ability to charge telecom companies for use of the right-of-way. The Budget Committee was notified about this issue during the March workshop. The timing and the details of this potential FCC action are currently unknown, but we believe that the FCC could take action to partially or completely preempt local government's authority to charge right-of-way use fees that are not cost-based. The city's annual telecom license fee is not cost-based, and it is calculated at 7% of a licensee's gross revenue. If enacted, such action could impact the general fund by reducing revenues by approximately $2 to $4 million annually, depending on the action implemented. While it's premature to take any action at this time, given the level of uncertainty, staff will continue to monitor the situation. Marijuana taxes consist of state shared revenue and local tax revenue. Let's start here with the state taxes. Cities receive 10% of the revenue from the state marijuana tax based on population and the city's share of state marijuana licensees. The Department of Revenue began collecting the tax in January of 2016, although there was a delay in distributing those funds to cities. As a result, our first state tax distribution included a one-time back payment of nearly $500,000, as you can see in green in the chart. The current year estimate and next year's budgeted amount have increased from $100,000 that you can see on the left up to $400,000, as you can see in blue. Since the initial distribution, we've received more timely payments, and we can expect that trend to continue in the future. This chart shows revenue from our local marijuana tax, which is collected and administered by the State Department of Revenue. The current budgeted amounts for FY18 and 19 remain conservative at $425,000 per year. This revenue has been designated by Council to fund park security, community court, and human services. Based on actual receipts, we are currently expecting more this fiscal year. This is represented by the blue bar in the middle at $675,000. Because this revenue is restricted for specific purposes, we've created a reserve in the general fund in the FY19 proposed budget to account for any excess collections from FY18 beyond the budgeted amount. This new reserve is currently set at $250,000, which you can see in green in the chart. This reserve allows us time to gain more experience with this relatively unknown market while also maintaining transparency regarding the use of these funds for council-designated purposes. Before spending any of the excess funds, they must be moved out of the reserve, allocated to one of these designated purposes, and approved by council. It's anticipated this may happen with the supplemental budget in December after we know the actual amount of FY18 receipts received. We've been talking about revenues for a while, so now let's turn our attention to expenditures. Here are some of the key expenditures in the general fund that impact the forecast, and we'll be taking a closer look at these over the next few slides. Here's a summary of general fund operating budgets over the last few years. The blue bars represent personnel expenses, which make up the majority of the general fund operating budget at more than 77% in FY19. Aside from wages, retirement expenses and health benefits are other significant components of personnel costs. In the chart, you can see bigger increases in FY16 and 18 in personnel costs due to PERS rate increases in those years. Some good news regarding personnel costs is that health insurance rates are less than previously projected in the adopted budget last year due to better than expected claims experience. The smaller green portion of the bars represents materials and services and capital outlay. Some good news in this category is that risk insurance rates are less than projected last year due to better claims experience, and fleet costs are lower than previous estimates in part due to stable fuel prices. Overall, the proposed general fund operating budget in FY19 is 1.6% higher than the FY18 adopted budget. This chart shows general fund FTE per 1,000 population over time. The ratio of general fund FTE to our population has continued to decline as a result of the recession and other factors. There are now over 50 fewer FTE in the general fund in the FY19 proposed budget compared to FY09. Over that same time period, the population has increased by 10%, which equates to more than 15,000 new residents. In FY19, to have a ratio equivalent to the FY09 level of 5.6 FTE per 1,000 population, the city would need to hire an additional 130 FTE in the general fund. That would be a 16% increase. You'll hear more from the city manager a little later about general fund FTE changes in the FY19 proposed budget. Now let's spend a little time talking about PERS. The chart on the left shows PERS revenue by source since 1970. As you can see, almost 3/4 of the system assets have come from investment income. About 21% is from employer contributions, and the remaining 6% is from member contributions. The chart on the right shows that 71% of the PERS liability is for participants who are no longer contributing to the system because they are either already retired or no longer working for a PERS employer. That means the cost of the liability is loaded onto the salaries of the other 29% of participants who are still working, which makes the cost of those benefits seem very high. This chart shows the current actuarial outlook for PERS rates in the long run for the system as a whole. Even though recent earnings have been favorable, PERS rates are still expected to increase significantly in FY20 and then again in FY22. After that, rates are projected to stabilize at those levels all the way through about 2035. The current unfunded liability is expected to be paid off by then, and rates will start to slowly decrease in the late 2030s as a result. This table here shows our PERS contribution rates assumed in the forecast, as well as estimated PERS costs for the general fund and all city funds combined. PERS rate changes occur in the even years, and you can see here that we expect sharp increases in 20 and 22 before leveling off, as I mentioned on the previous slide. On a related note, the update you received on April 26th included an informational memo regarding Senate Bill 1566. This bill establishes the Employer Incentive Fund to encourage PERS employers to make lump sum payments to pay down their unfunded liability by providing a partial match. The match rate could be up to 25% with an upper limit on the maximum amount to be matched. Several important steps, such as identification of sufficient state funding and the development of rules and processes, must occur before PERS begins accepting applications for matching funds. PERS staff also anticipate potential statutory clarifications or adjustments to the Senate Bill 1566 during the 2019 legislative session. City staff will continue to monitor the implementation of the Employer Incentive Fund through the coming year, and we anticipate this topic to be of conversation for the FY20 budget season. So we've covered various general fund revenues and expenditures, some of which have improved and others have worsened. So what does it all mean? The good news this year, as John mentioned, is that changes in forecast drivers overall have been favorable since last year. And the forecast is now in a stable position in the near term without requiring the implementation of budget cuts in FY19 and 20 that were previously assumed last year. You can see this improvement in the chart on the left where you see revenues are greater than expenditures through FY21. The forecast is projected to remain stable through the next PERS rate increase in FY20, although the final 3 years of the forecast are in a deficit position primarily due to another PERS rate increase in FY22. This is evident on the right side of the chart where projected expenditures become greater than revenues. This out-year deficit could translate into an approximate $3 million annual budget gap if projections continue as currently forecast. Here's a projection of our general fund reserve for revenue shortfall through the forecast period. The $15.5 million in reserves attributable to the one-time funds from Comcast are shown in green, while reserve funds from other sources are shown in blue. The dashed line represents our target level of 8% of expenditures. You can see in the chart that the total reserve is expected to remain steady through FY21. Then in FY22, with another PERS rate increase, the reserve begins to drop to cover the projected deficit if no other actions are taken. By FY23, we will have exhausted reserves from other sources and started to utilize the reserve from the Comcast settlement. And by FY24, the reserve is projected to fall below the 8% target. And here are some areas of uncertainty that we will continue to monitor closely, starting with the expenses on the left. Future PERS rates, of course, may vary from our current assumptions. Deferred maintenance remains an ongoing challenge for the general fund. The average age of general fund buildings is about 33 years, and almost 25% of buildings are more than 40 years old. We also have 3 bargaining units with employees in the general fund whose contracts will be under negotiation over the next couple of years. Future personnel costs could be higher than projected in the current forecast if cost of living adjustments vary from our assumed general inflation rate. And inflation does appear at long last to be bubbling up after years of remaining at historical lows. While this is a good indication that the economy is improving, it's also a financial impact to the general fund. For example, an increase of just 0.5% annually over the inflation rates assumed in the forecast would increase costs by an estimated $10.5 million over the forecast period. So moving over to the revenue side, we saw previously that small changes in the property tax growth rate can have big revenue impacts. The 2018 legislative session included a bill that would have repealed the property tax exemption for centrally assessed telecommunications companies. Although the bill was not enacted last session, it is expected to return in 2019. And lastly, the FCC issue mentioned earlier could have a negative impact on future revenues. So in summary, our current projections have improved in the near term, but we're still expecting budget gaps in the out years of the forecast. For these reasons, as well as the uncertainty shown here, it's important to keep in mind that the general fund remains in a cautionary status. And with that, I'll turn it back over to the city manager.
For FY19, the executive team continues to prioritize neighborhood and downtown vitality, public safety, community justice, as well as continuing our ongoing investments in CRO, Vision Zero, emergency preparedness, economic development, human services, and social services. And as part of our budget, we are proposing about $1.2 million in the general fund of one-time investments. And I'll go through a few of these, and there's much more detail if you were to dive into the budget itself. With the police staffing support, this would be backfill hiring of 2 officers in FY19, which allows for training of new hires and to help move staffing levels closer to recommended levels until a more permanent solution for EPD's staffing needs is identified. And as you know, as a part of our community justice initiative, there's a lot of work going on around the staffing needs for EPD as well as the support structure around that. Funding to cover increased costs associated with maintaining the current number of jail beds leased by the city from municipal offenders at the Lane County Jail, which we have 15 beds, in Springfield for 10 beds, is increasing. The cost of leasing the current number of jail beds at Lane County is increasing by approximately $150,000 in FY19, and a projected increase of approximately $50,000 for the city of Springfield. And so that $200,000 allows us to continue to leasing the same amount of beds as we have been in the past. There's dollars for continuing the community court program for an additional fiscal year. As you know, that's an extremely successful program. We're updating the land use code to support the council direction to meet our housing needs within the urban growth boundary. We're also recommending $80,000 for cloud-based data storage of body-worn camera footage. There's, as part of Envision Eugene and the expansion area in the Clear Lake area, we're recommending dollars for wetland mitigation, stormwater and infrastructure analysis related to the direction to provide 3,000 industrial jobs in the Bethel region. And we're also including $30,000, again, as part of the Envision Eugene program for neighborhood planning in the university area. These are ongoing general fund changes, and you'll notice with the exception of the very first one, all of these are revenue backed or some other cost neutral. And so for us, any ongoing changes to the general fund, new ongoing changes, represents $8,000. And this is for a community engagement specialist in Mark Gissner's, the police auditor's office. The position was added in the FY18 adopted budget, and it provides community engagement and outreach services. So this provides as an ongoing funding for that particular position. A couple of the other revenue or backed or cost neutral. The associate planner will help implement Envision Eugene through a range of efforts, including urban reserves, neighborhood and area plans, downtown revitalization, housing strategies, development readiness in the Clear Lake area, and related research and analysis and urban design work. We're proposing adding an economic development and job creation analyst, and they will develop a long-range strategies for job creation and to meet business and nonprofit partner needs. A community programs analyst will coordinate HUD annual plans, reporting requirements, fair housing activities, housing policy board, and CDBG advisory committee support. The business license coordinator will process background and safety checks pertaining to the city's regulated personal passenger vehicles, Uber and Lyft. And the nuisance abatement program funding will aid in addressing the backlog of nuisance abatement complaints, and funding will be used to engage contractors who will address dangerous buildings, garbage and rodents, and sanitation complaints across the city. There are some additional general fund changes that are different than what I just mentioned to you. For example, the airport staff funding change really just moves the 1.74 FTE from the general fund to the municipal airport fund. As you know, airports pay for and are responsible for all their related costs. And so these are costs that are rightly and appropriately should be charged to the airport fund. So that's what that does. And also, the second item there, you might remember, is part of the FY18 adopted budget. The council directed us to include these dollars as an appropriation of $750,000 in this year's budget to staff the 24/7 ALS ambulances for an additional year. There are non-general fund items that are also being proposed in the budget. I'll review a few of these, and again, details can be found within the budget, or if there's questions, we'll have people that will be able to answer them in the future meetings. But a few of the items include, in 2017, the state legislature passed a transportation package that will increase City of Eugene revenues from the State Highway Transportation Fund for transportation-related projects by approximately $1 million annually beginning in FY18, and this is estimated to increase to approximately $5 million by FY24. The ongoing increased revenue is a result of increases in state gas tax, motor vehicle registration, title fees, bicycle tax, new light vehicle dealer privilege tax, and the public transportation payroll tax. The proposed budget transfers $1.3 million from the road fund to the Transportation Capital Projects Fund to fund the railroad quiet zone. And the road fund will also transfer $1 million to the Transportation Capital Projects Fund did on the FY18 June supplemental budget, and another $1.3 million in FY20. There are also 3 additional crossings in the Urban Renewal Agency Riverfront District boundary that will be funded using URA funds. In July 2018, 30 lane miles of Highway 99 from I-5 to Franklin Boulevard will become city right-of-way. It's part of a jurisdictional transfer from the state to the city. And this ongoing funding provides for operations and maintenance of these additional lane miles and 2 FTE. So that funding is a part of that package, as well as the FTE. We're also proposing funding for 2 years for a second dedicated sidewalk repair crew to address sidewalks damaged by trees, as well as GIS management and data maintenance of sidewalks. Additional non-general funding includes existing unimproved streets that have not previously received a maintenance overlay, reducing the pruning cycle of an estimated 100,000 street trees. The current cycle is 40 years, and this will reduce that to 10 years to match best management practice guidelines. And the reduced pruning will assist with hazard abatement, lessen the impact of storm-related damage and tree failure, and increase the economic and environmental value of the forest. There's additional dollars in there for implementing the TSP and Vision Zero action plans. There are matching funds for the contract with Friends of Trees to perform infield tree planting, establishment, and initial pruning and outreach, and also for developing the scope of work and software designed to replace the city's existing permitting software. This is a piece of a larger project to replace software that was written 19 years ago. And these are just a few of the items that are in this particular portion of that, which we can go into more detail if there's an interest in that. And as you know, we continue to make strategic investments in the community to ensure forward momentum on shared goals in many areas. And we've just talked about the FY19 budget, but I just want to take a couple of minutes to highlight some of the work in many of these strategic areas, some of which are impacted by FY19, some of which were also impacted by recent supplemental budgets in the FY18 budget, to just give a sense of all the things that are underway here in the city. These items are all part of the FY19 budget and our efforts to strengthen planning in neighborhoods downtown and throughout the community. The Clear Lake expansion area represents one of the largest changes to our urban growth boundary in many years. The Downtown Streets Master Plan will create a design for use of the narrow right-of-way to find solutions for the increase in demands placed on both the sidewalk and travelway in our downtown. Preliminary work has begun to build upon the success of e-Build and to expand its scope. A dedicated software development team will be brought together in FY19 to work solely on this effort and take the benefits of an online digital paperless process into the field. In addition to the items here, Council approved using $100,000 one-time funds on the FY18 supplemental budget for neighborhood planning for River Road, Santa Clara, and the university neighborhoods, and those are moving forward. Through the reappropriation of funds on the supplemental budget, we're also working to develop a new growth monitoring database that will track and use activity and other key indicators of growth management. The Land Use Code update in the FY19 budget will allow the Planning Division to update this code. And this change is based on a City Council directed priority to enable the city to meet its housing needs within the urban growth boundary. We continue to leverage federal funds to support a variety of new affordable housing, down payment assistance, human service capital facilities, and expanding economic opportunities for individuals and businesses. As you know, we provide a plethora of resources and support to a range of emergency and transitional and permanent housing programs and other homeless services to a variety of nonprofit and social service organizations. And just to give you a few, in FY18, we've spent, there was over $970,000 in general fund and $350,000 in CDBG monies to the Human Services Commission for these kinds of services, over $160,000 of one-time funds to support Dusk to Dawn. The homeless car camping program received almost $90,000. Into the December supplemental budget, which were one-time dollars, the homeless outreach pilot project, he set aside $120,000. The Lindholm Center expansion of hours onto the weekends for $75,000. Another $60,000 to our homeless car camping program. Cahoots is part of FY17. As you know, we increased support to Cahoots by $225,000 on an ongoing basis for vans to provide enhanced services, particularly for the most critical hours at night and early morning. Just a couple of items in public safety. It remains an important priority for us in the downtown and throughout the community. We've continued to see improvements in our downtown, and council approved an additional $350,000 in one-time monies in December for public safety programming and cleaning to continue our downtown operations into this year. We also approved $170,000 in one-time funding for increased patrols, bike patrols. The FY19 budget includes $270,000 in one-time funding for training of new hires and to increase backfill staffing levels. This year's proposed budget also includes a third-year increase for funds for the Green Hill contract, so they can continue to make progress on the operations of the First Avenue shelter. As I mentioned before, we've included $80,000 for cloud-based storage for body cameras. Last December, you approved $180,000 for an additional firefighting staffing academy. And you also added 2 BLS units and an ALS unit last year. As well, in FY19, we're proposing $300,000 from the general fund to the PSAP fund to support communications center staffing. Community justice, you'll hear a lot more about this in a couple of weeks, but just to give you the success rate on this, if you were to talk to Judge Allen, part of the statistic he will say is that graduates of community court, 91% of graduates of community court do not reoffend within 12 years. And that's a tremendous success rate. So if you want to talk about how to get a great return on investment, our investment in community courts has been tremendous. The community court is also collaborating with many partners on things like the mental health court, veterans court, teen court, which also have a great benefit as well. Mentioned earlier that there's money in the FY19 budget to continue the number of jail beds that we have both at Lane County and in Springfield. And there's one-time funding of $200,000 for a limited duration assistant city prosecutor to ensure that current case disposition times don't increase and there isn't a backlog that reoccurs. Vision Zero. In 2017, I mentioned the transportation legislation, the transportation package that was passed, and we're going to get money for that. Initially, those resources are going to help fund things like the railroad quiet zone, additional funding for a transportation safety lead position to support Vision Zero and street design, and dollars to continue the sidewalk maintenance program in FY19 and FY20. Climate recovery ordinance. As you might remember, in December, you approved almost $300,000 for climate recovery ordinance implementation, primarily to make significant progress on our community climate and energy action plan. In January, the Fleet Division and Fire Department released an internal climate action plan to make progress on the city's goal of carbon neutral operations. The city's pavement preservation program continues to be a leader in promoting sustainability and greenhouse gas reduction. And the FY19 budget also includes $100,000 in ongoing funding in the stormwater utility funds for green infrastructure staffing for our stormwater system. And as I mentioned earlier, dollars to fund our urban forestry program. Emergency preparedness. The state of Oregon awarded us a grant in almost $700,000 to contract with vendors to perform seismic rehab work on 3 fire stations, and that work's being done. In September 2017, you approved the purchase of a site for a new emergency operations center, and also you approved the funding for that previously. In FY19, we're recommending one-time funding of a little over $130,000 to establish a redundant fiber connection to the Roosevelt Yard facility, which will allow computers and phone lines to continue operations if the primary connection fails. And we're also including $1.2 million for seismic bridge strengthening. Economic prosperity. The area's employment rate is the lowest it has been in decades, and we continue to work with our private sector and nonprofit partners to increase economic prosperity for the city and the region. And the Regional Prosperity Plan is the coordinated effort that we work across a number of jurisdictions. In December, you approved $100,000 in funds for an Economic Prosperity Strategic Reserve Fund to allow us to partner with local organizations on initiatives that enhance economic opportunities in the community. And as I mentioned earlier, this budget proposal includes dollars for an economic development and job creation analyst. So to wrap this up, the FY19 budget fits within a broader financial management framework, one that continues to be guided by our principles and philosophy of stewardship, as well as the needs of the community and the goals of council. The spending proposal for next year makes progress in a number of high priority policy areas and does so in a way that limits our ongoing spending commitments. Adding ongoing spending commitments could put us further out of balance in the years ahead as we face future PERS rate increases and potential threats to some of our key sources of new revenue. We do have a bright future, and there's a lot of exciting things happening in Eugene right now. We know that what we've been doing is working, and I think this budget follows up on our prior choices in a thoughtful and meaningful way. And with that, we'll turn it back over to you, Scott.
Thank you. We're a little ahead of schedule. We're going to go ahead and take a 10-minute break.
Just a really quick question. Should we do clarifications now, or do you want to save all of it for the break?
We'll save it until afterwards. We'll go right into discussion. So we'll let's be back at what was that, 6:35. Okay, let's take a break.
Clarifications are different than questions. Because I'm thinking, defined benefit plan should require a member contribution. We don't ever
Welcome back, and thank you, staff, for the presentation. We'll start with our points of clarification, discussion topics. We'll start from the right-hand side with Councilor Clark.
Is this just points of clarification or questions?
Or questions?
Is there a difference? Page 15.
It's your 3 minutes. The buzzer will sound at the end of 3 minutes.
Thank you.
I don't
Page
want to alarm you
15?
there.
Can we bring up page 15, please? Or slide 15, I guess. My time's still running, so I guess I'll ask the question here. The silt, that's the silt page that I'm asking you to bring up there on slide 15. E-Web silt of, 12 million, 13 million. And I know what silt is. My question is, why do we pay silt? Maybe that's a question for the manager.
Why do we pay silt? Is this in the sense of, I'm just trying to,
What's the agreement? Why do we pay silt? Why does E-Web pay us silt? Excuse me, that's what I'm trying to ask. Sorry. I got confused with trying to watch this while I was asking the question. Sorry about that.
I think we are paying a silt, right?
Right. Sorry. I misspoke there. Now we're all on the same page. Why does E-Web pay us silt? I know what it is. I'm just asking why they do it.
Well, I'm trying to think about how to answer that. It's in lieu of taxes, so that's what,
Right.
what it stands for.
That's what it stands for, right? As I say, I know what it is. I'm saying, why do they pay it to us?
Why do they pay taxes?
I don't have a good answer for that either, other than they have a drain on our services as an entity, as a body. Even though they're a public entity, they own a lot of land, they don't pay property taxes because they're public, but they are a drain on a lot of city services. And so my real question is, why doesn't the U of O pay us a silt?
I don't know the answer to that.
I'd like to explore that opportunity, or at least have some conversation about it as we go on, because I think that the university students are a draw on city services, and used to be in years past considerably so, and that many of them pay that in their rent, but a quarter or more of students live on campus on state land and don't pay anything. And so I wonder if that's not something we shouldn't have as more of a conversation. Okay, now slide number 25, please. It's either 24 or 25. It's the one with the PERS thing at the bottom. And that's it. So if I'm looking at this right, in 3 years, the PERS costs are going to go up 50%.
Where does that come from?
Between 19 and 22, it goes from 24 million to 38 million. Bottom of the page.
Yes.
50% increase in 3 years. Okay, so let's talk about Senate Bill 1566 for a minute. Or how deeply are we exploring that? Are we going to do it? Do we like the idea? Do we know enough yet? What?
I think this is the one on whether or not we want to create a side account.
We give them a big chunk of money. They match it 25%. Let's say we give them $8 million of the Comcast money that's above the line up there for the next 3 or 4 years. We give them that $8 million. They match it with another 2. We get the return on the 10, plus it cuts our long-term PERS costs, right?
Yeah, so I think there's, as Mauricio mentioned, I think all the rules aren't out yet, so all the, we don't know all what the impacts are, nor what they're planning to fund it at, so that's one piece. We do think it'll be an important conversation for next year's budget, because that's when it actually would be available
Implemented.
to be able to take advantage of that. And then I do think it's a conversation around how do you want to spend those dollars? It's an opportunity cost. So if you invest $8 million in that versus for 20 years, you're essentially sort of prepaying, as opposed to something else that those dollars are available for. That's a conversation around an opportunity cost.
Well, it's not just an opportunity cost, and I would say for our analysis of it, when we get there, I'd love to have the specific metrics of it, because it shaves future costs from ever existing. And so I want to balance that on good information. You know, what we pay now will cost us even more later than maybe investing a little bit now, especially when they're willing to match up to 25% of covering a cost. So that's a way, the way I see it so far, to lower future PERS increases pretty substantially and not have a big problem in the 3-4 out years. Last thing, you said a position to fund for sidewalks damaged by trees. Don't we charge the property owner for such things?
We do. But
So why are we funding somebody else to do it?
Yeah, so we're proposing a pilot program where we partner with property owners. What we've been doing is people right now have an opportunity to either hire a contractor to do the work, or they can hire Public Works Maintenance to do the work. Most people choose to go with the Public Works Maintenance option. And so this is a pilot that would allow us to enhance that at a second crew and also include the urban forestry staff, because what we're learning is that 3/4 of the sidewalk issues are tree issues, tree root
Yeah.
issues. So they
Why not
kind of
put 'em
come
in my
together.
All right, thank you. I know it's a can of worms with the idea of the U of O paying a silt, but I think if not from the university or from the state, then certainly from student fees for those that are on campus. Thanks.
Thank you. Josh?
All right. Thank you, Mike. My comments won't seem quite so high maintenance now. So I'm going to need a couple of rounds here because there's a lot of stuff here. But I want to lead off by saying this is the clearest and most integrated budget I've seen in my 4+ years on the committee. In terms of the budget message, the budget forecast, I really like the city focus section or sections. So thank you, and I think that goes well with the transparency site. But I think this is really, this was great. This was a joy to read. I want to call out evidence of good fiscal stewardship. I think people don't sort of say this, but if there are people watching at home and they want to go through this, in the budget message on page 2, the state of the reserve for revenue shortfall, and on page 3, the FTE count. I know you talked about that, but I really want to emphasize where we are on that. Both John and Mauricio talked about this. In attachment E, page 36, the community court is humane and compassionate and just, but it's also fiscally responsible, and you pointed that out. I appreciate that. Attachment E, also page 52, the continuous fall in our backlog for street repair is amazing. I feel like that's the, I think I can say this without tearing up, the ghost of Kirk Corey helping us out. He was really devoted to that. He was my budget committee buddy. And having heard him talk about that many times, to see that evidence there is amazing. There's also really good, I think, communication and listening and integration in here in the budget message, but also in the budget transparency tool. In listening, I think there are many places we could call this out, but not just the funding for the railroad quiet zone, but the funding strategy. I feel like you know, council has really listened to the community on that. I certainly have heard that from many people, sort of the broader area where I live. So I think that's fantastic. I also think there's listening to the community and some integration with the CRO. So I'll come back to that in some of the details, especially in inclusion as a category in the unfunded needs assessment. I do have some clarifications and constructive criticisms and comments as well. I'm not going to get to all of them in this round. Let me just call out a couple. John, I think you've done a really good job telling us to focus each year and not panic about things. I think actually we're close enough to panic that maybe we start get some adrenaline in our system. Stable is fine, I guess, as an adjective, but actually it's in the fairly short term that this stability goes away and we soon have structural deficits. And actually that section, the section not in the forecast, it's good, but the section on the reserve for revenue shortfall in the budget message, I think, is actually misleading. It needs like 1 or 2 more sentences to say to people, you know, it's great now, but it's not going to be shortly. I think that's really important to emphasize to people, and I'll pick up some other things in the next round.
Yeah, next round for me, too.
Thanks, Josh.
Yeah.
Councilor Pryor?
What I just looked up with regard to SILT, contributions in lieu of taxes, is it's where nonprofit, or tax-exempt government agencies which don't pay property taxes will make this payment in lieu of the property taxes that weren't paid. So that's what the silt is, which then leads to the question, if part of that contribution in lieu of taxes is based on property tax revenue that's not paid, EWEB has just sold a large piece of property. So if the property taxes that would have been paid on that property but are not because it's exempt are now part of a sale of that property, would EWEB's silt payment go down as a result of not having as much property that's exempt that they are paying silt on? I mean, it's a question not for now, but would the silt payment go down because EWEB no longer has as much property to be exempt from?
Not that I'm aware of. It's purely based on 6% of their electric retail sale revenue, plus a fixed component that is adjusted to inflation. And neither one of those is tied to how much property they have.
Okay, so the silt payment is not based on property taxes. It's based on their revenues.
Right.
Okay.
Why is important? I'm sorry.
Yeah, interesting. Okay, so that would not affect that.
Correct.
Okay. My general impressions are that we're trying to be as fiscally responsible as we can and still accommodate the priorities that we have. So I'll be curious to see how this works through. I don't have specifics at this point. I'm just curious to see how we maintain the balance for all these different moving parts and bells and whistles.
Thank you. Emily?
So I'm going to piggyback a little bit, I think, off of Joshua's comments. For me, a lot of really great transparency, and I'm always just looking for more data. So as this is my first year, I may have missed some of the historical conversations that add some context to this. But when I'm looking at changes in the money that we're spending on things, I really want to see how they're linked to future needs. As population goes up, per capita funding is going down, we're seeing these really narrow margins. And one thing I'd love to see is a little more exposure to what we expect our demographics to look like, and to really include that in some of the analysis and the transparency. Because I think that's really important to drive investment decisions and to prioritize them. Age, ability, involvement in the workforce, where folks are living, their transit needs. I think having a really good geographic and demographic basis to what we're seeing for each of these categories would provide a lot of really great information. And piggybacking off that a little bit as well, I'm really interested in looking at some of these one-time investments that really do seem like they're going to ongoing services. So especially when we're talking about hiring folks for the backfilling police department, the city prosecutor, emergency services, completely understand that we are in this status that we want to make sure we're not making investments that we can't hold to in the future. But what I didn't see was a timeline. So these aren't a one-time project, it's an ongoing service. So at one point, do we draw a go, no-go for when these services are ended? And if we're making these one-time investments, then I think they need to come along with an ending plan to make sure that if we're investing one time in something that looks like it should be ongoing, but we end up ending it, then you can end up with a lot of loose ends that I think could be problematic fiscally. So those are my comments, and I'll probably have more as we go along.
Thank you. John?
Overall, I think great job, and for those of you that remember me last year, I really don't have an agenda, and I'm not going to try to cause trouble. However, I am going to make the same analogy which I made last year, which was that the priorities of Eugene, as expressed in the budget, are like a donut, and we keep expanding outward and incorporating, these new and exciting programs and ideas and promoting kind of favorite little topics, but we're still neglecting the core and the most basic and fundamental services that the city has a legal and moral obligation to provide. Specifically their safety and security is again sorely lacking in the budget. We found capacity in the budget to add 14 FTEs and to move things around, to spend $5 million on the railroad quiet zones. And I'm not disputing that these are not great and important and desirable. However, they're we're only proposing adding 2 police officer positions in a department that's drastically understaffed. The 911 center, has no significant improvement on their staffing problems. Last year, we had a lot of discussion about the merits and the needs for additional ambulances. And although ultimately we were able to add some, they were only half funded. The fire department ended up having to scrape together the rest of the funds to, fulfill that obligation. And so my concern is that there's already been a lot of discussions about the community safety levy being presented to the voters in the fall. And I'm sure there's going to be a lot of compelling discussions then about how great the need is, how if the voters don't approve the additional funds, that there's going to be, the safety of the community is going to be at risk. The problem is if we don't do everything we possibly can in this budget now and get as far as we can to addressing some of those problems that we're going to be bringing up in 6 months to the voters, that and demonstrate that we've done everything that we currently can with our current resources, that council is going to have a really challenging time asking the voters for more money. So in my opinion, the proposed budget puts forward some flawed priorities, and I hope that as a committee that we can correct them and arrive at a consensus that reflects the needs of the entire community.
Thank you. I appreciate all the hard work in the budget and the presentation. I agree with Josh's comments that it's very transparent and easy to read. I enjoyed reading it very much, and I'm going to pass my my questions and comments for a later round. Councilor Sim.
Thank you. John?
Yes.
Mostly, thank you. That's a lot of what I was going to say. People are probably pretty familiar with my pet concerns, but number one is public safety, and we do put a huge chunk of our money into that, and yet it's sorely lacking, and it does affect the whole city, not just downtown, my personal hotspot. So I read this whole thing, but I'm mostly interested in the unfunded needs, of course, because that's where we get to arm wrestle a little bit. So I really encourage us to do the overhires for the police and 911. I think those are my 2 pressing. That's 2 of my most important issues, and those are the top 2 things I would pick from the unfunded needs. I'm also concerned that continuing the COURT program is an unfunded need. Maybe that's not true, but I'm really surprised at number 64. Number 72, a homeless services support person. I've been asked why can't we have that for the last 2 years. So it may not be the way we want to go, but I would like to talk about it a little bit because it's been a continuing ask for me. And I think we already know the county's wanting us to put in some money for the expanded car camping. And I know it's everybody's business, the state, the county, and the city, but I want to make sure that we're doing what we can for this really, really big problem. So I'd like to see some of those happen. Totally into the sidewalks and the trees. It's a safety issue, it's a CRO issue, it's a neighborhood happiness issue. So I think that's may not seem that important to some people, but I think it affects almost everybody who walks and likes the trees. And left over from last year's discussion, I know it's a really big item, but I'd like to see us get planning for the money, is the fleet building. It doesn't really matter if we can't get across the river, if we can't even get our safety people around because we have no garage and everything's ruined. So those are my first concerns. I have little red question marks all through my book, so Sarah's going to be really happy to get together with me. Thanks.
Thank you. Jill?
So first of all, thank you for the budget presentation, and I just think the open budget website is it's just easy to navigate, and it's just really nice. I think a lot of people who have just basic computer skills will be able to get on there, and they'll be able to dig down as deep as they're interested. So I thought that was done a really nice job. Question on slide 29, this police staffing support, is that for 911? Is that what you said? That first line item? And is that one-time funds? I was not quite clear on that.
It's one-time money, and it's actually not adding an FTE or FTE. It's essentially overhire. You can think of it as sort of overhire dollars.
Okay. Okay. Sorry. Overhire, meaning?
So, in more detail,
Is that different than the unfunded needs one?
So, yes, this is overhire for, I believe, 911 and police officers. So, it's
Make
not.
sure you introduce yourself.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm acting finance manager, Julie Schaefer, with the police department. I apologize for that. But yes, I'm sorry. It is new hires. It's new hire training and backfill officers for police.
Okay. Was it one-time funds, or what was the term you used? I don't understand that term. What did you say? Overhire. Yeah.
Overhire. It's one-time funding for overhires, as Julie was saying. And so what we want to do is help the police department have resources to get ahead of upcoming retirements and things like that by having some more resource in their budget to start hiring in advance of people leaving the organization so that we can get ahead of it, because it takes so long to ramp up once you hire a police officer to get them on board. And so this is kind of to help jumpstart that a little bit.
Thank you very much. The other thing is, I think I've been quiet on it for the last couple of years, but this is my last year on the budget committee, so I'm going to speak up again on it again. And that is, that's interesting. I mean, I don't know enough about it, but the SILT for the UO, that's super interesting. I'm interested in revenue, and there's a couple things that I just have never quite understood. Why, like, Eugene doesn't have a business license tax like every other city, and $100 a year for every business in Eugene for all the benefits, and I'm getting fiber for my office, and that's all benefit for from being in the city of Eugene. And I think that's low-hanging fruit, and also having a hotel tax that goes to the city, especially with 2021 coming up. I just really think that, considering keeping that 8% revenue for reserve for revenue shortfall, I think that's super important. And I think that along with some of the other strategies that have been discussed by other counselors and budget committee members, is that we really should think about some of this low-hanging fruit. And I really think I'd love to pay a business license. I mean, and I've been in business in Eugene for almost 20 years, so that would have been revenue that the city could have had, but they don't. So I would really support some real thought on this.
You can still make a contribution.
Oh, yes. Thank you, Josh. Yes.
We'll take care of you.
Yes, right. So I guess I would just encourage thought in our discussions about that. It's very nice to be in a position where it's not slash and burn, but we have some, in a stable environment, we have some opportunities to be thoughtful about some of these revenues that would be very, very painless for most people to participate and make our city better. So I would like to be focused as much as we can on considering some of those in our discussions this season.
Thank you.
So I guess going 8th means I get to just second what a lot of other people said. So I guess going kind of backwards around. I really would like to hear more conversations about revenue and that question, because it feels like when we're getting increases in property taxes and increases in other areas of revenue, it's going towards sort of increases in existing expenses, PERS or inflation or staffing costs that are going up. And there's just a lot of things in that unfunded needs assessment. There's a lot of deferred maintenance. It feels like we just aren't having the revenue to maintain the level of service that we're expecting. And how can we look at that? How can we adjust that? And I know it's a lot of outside factors, but is there a way to look at that? I also want to second the comments about public safety. I think one of my first reactions on reading the budget was like, really, with all of the conversation that's going on about public safety, we're talking about 2 overhires in this, and that just seems surprising to me, knowing kind of where things were. And then last, I being the first year, I had the same question about the one-time funds and the one-time expenditures, because like I'm looking at these one-time expenditures, and some of those are really clearly one-time things. We're going to develop a plan, and then the plan will be done, and that's done. But like there are other things, like if do we expect the jailbread leasing costs to go down next year? Do we expect to not have to pay for the video storage for the body cameras? That sounds like it's cloud-based, so I'm assuming they're charging a yearly fee. And so I was just curious as to why those operational type expenditures were seen as one time, if we expect them to be ongoing, or are we just gonna like not store the video anymore in 2 years? So those were my questions.
Thank you, Sean.
Good presentation, thank you. So just a couple specific questions to start and then a general comment. Last year, with all the talk about the additional advanced life support unit, there was a big part of the expense wasn't just equipment, it was staffing. But in the budget, I don't see a proposed increase to FTEs. I just wonder how that's going to be accomplished.
I think it's already
That was the first part of what you said.
So the ALS unit requires, I believe, additional staffing, yet we propose from 2018 to 2019 shift operations personnel to be flat. And so I'm just trying to reconcile that, how we're accomplishing that.
Fire Chief. The ALS staffing, we are presently staffing that at time and a half. In July, we'll, similar to police, where it takes a while to ramp up to get our staffing trained and online. It took us about a year to 15 months. So in July, we will be doing that staffing at straight time. And between the straight time staffing reduction in our expenditures and the ability to then generate the revenue, we will have the ability to cover our expenses for the next year. And so that we're good until next June 30th. We are making adjustments within the system to balance our advanced life support and basic life support. And we feel like we have a pathway to get the services to the community and to balance our revenues and expenditures as well.
Okay, great. I just know, because I think a lot of the impetus behind investing in that was to respond to the growing concern about sort of wearing out the existing staff with overtime. And so it sounds like you have a way to mitigate that and respond to that. So
We are actively hiring the largest classes available, 2 in a row. As of yet, we are reducing our drafting or mandatory overtime consistently, and we're going to continue to hire until we eliminate our mandatory overtime.
Okay, great, thank you. Secondly, I'm just a little confused on exactly what we're doing with the $1 million that was discussed and sort of set aside, I think, for a discussion regarding a homeless shelter. And I know it's addressed here, I don't quite follow where it is, what we're doing with it, what we can use it for or not use it for. So I don't know if we can touch on that now or at another time.
So briefly, and then others can add more detail that they want to. So what the council directed us to do is to come back to them with recommendations on how best to spend that $1 million. And so part of what we are in the process of is working with the county. They're doing a feasibility study on public shelters. When they complete that study, we'll take that information as well as other information from staff perspective that we've collected and analyzed, and then provide a recommendation back to the council on how best to, our recommendation on spending that $1 million. And I think that's probably in the fall.
The final report in December 1st or so.
Yeah, so that's where it's at. Okay. So it's just sitting there pending sort of that work to be done.
Okay, great. So it's off limits until then.
Yes, right, yes, unless the council chooses something different,
Okay.
but yeah.
Great. And then finally, I think we're going to have a busy next few weeks because we're going to talk about revenue, we're going to talk about all sorts of things. But also, I'm really interested in exploring with some real data points like you commented that community court, as we all know, has a really good sort of return on investment. I think that's right. I don't know that for a fact. And if it is a really good return on investment, what other investments in similar types of services have a great return, and sort of when does that diminishing marginal return even out to zero, and how can we dump more funds into that instead of into other areas that aren't as good of a return? Because we do have some opportunities to increase revenue. We have some opportunities to sort of move around expenses and maybe decrease, but if we can invest $1 here and save $2 over here, that seems like a no-brainer. And so I would really like to understand, with services like community court, should we double our spend there? Should we triple it? Because we're getting such a great return elsewhere. And I'm not sure that that's in this document. So anyways, interested in exploring that.
Okay, I'm glad you mentioned that $1 million for shelter. It was not just set aside for any homeless thing, it's for shelter. And I hope it doesn't get diverted to something temporary, because you can spend money over and over on campsites and never make much progress. And I hope that time doesn't run out before we actually invest it in a shelter. And I'm glad that Jill mentioned revenue. A business license, I think we should get serious about that. And about a hotel tax, which goes for something besides just encouraging more people to come here. It's a way to have people who do come here and use all our services, use our parks and our pools and our streets to help pay for those things. And I think it's an easy way to get some revenue. I was glad to hear, I think I heard that we're spending some money on sidewalks. My opinion is that the city should pay for sidewalks totally, everywhere. And I know we're far from that. I think that would be much better use of money than paying for a quiet zone. I hear one complaint I hear from a lot of people, they say, why are you spending millions of dollars for a quiet zone? It's $7 million, isn't it? I heard someone just say $5 million. I think it's $7 million.
It's 5 out of the budget, but it's...
I'd have to go back and look, but yes, it's in that magnitude.
Okay, I don't think that if we asked the public if they wanted to vote for that they would vote for taking money out of the road fund for that. And the 911, that's a place that I think really needs more money. I understand, I just hear, I haven't seen it directly, but I hear that people get really worn out. Most people who work there get really worn out from overtime and from the tension of the job. It's a job that I think a lot of people could not do. And it's not only do they get worn out from overtime, but probably they're a lot less efficient, and it costs more money to pay overtime. Well, I would hope that we would invest more in that. Thank you.
Thank you. In the queue, we have Josh, Councilor Clark, and Councilor Semple. Josh.
Go ahead. No, go ahead.
Okay.
Sure, yeah.
So first of all, I want to reinforce what Councilor Clark said about the Employer Incentive Fund. I hope Council brings this up and talks about how we could, following the same logic, pay down our obligation. I understand you don't want to lose a lot of flexibility, and it's nice to have a larger revenue reserve for revenue shortfall, but that just seems like that might be fiscally prudent. I hope we look closely at it. I really appreciate Jill's comments about business license, and I encourage people as we start to look at revenue questions to look back at the work done. This is before I joined the Budget Committee, so more than 5 years ago, we had a revenue team that assembled a whole bunch of options. I can almost guarantee you, if you have a revenue idea, it's in there. It's a long menu of options with the pros and cons, so we don't need to reinvent that wheel. And then following on Sean's comments, I really appreciate the cost-benefit questions. some of you may recall I asked exactly that when we increased funding for Cahoots. There was no clear talk about there was a general sense that that would have high bang for the buck in terms of saving EPD time, but we haven't really revisited that. It would be nice to have some data on that and find out the cost effectiveness of some of these things. There may be other reasons to do these things. Cost effectiveness may not figure into it, but it'd be nice to have that information as well. I want to respond to the comments about seismic. There was Jamie sent out, let's see, April 26th or so, an update on the sort of the questions that we had, or maybe I should say the questions that I had. You may have noticed my name appeared in there a few times. I was looking for other people's names desperately, not finding them. But thank you for reporting on those questions. In the spirit of several of the comments that have been made, including John's about really worrying about basic needs, I would consider fire insurance a basic need. No, I'm not talking about fire and ambulance. I'm talking about a safety net. And my comments about seismic have been about that. How big is our unfunded liability in the event of a Cascadia quake of magnitude 9? So this is something that is when, not if. We know that. And what was reported here about the assessment is good, but I want to just briefly clarify what I asked for, what's here, and then what's not here. Because I think this is something we desperately owe to the community, and there's a huge gap currently in the unfunded needs assessment. But I don't think my question was clear enough, so I didn't get an answer. I also want to point out
we don't have a clock, yeah.
My time hasn't started, which is awesome, by the way. But you might want to start that, or
you'll go forever.
I don't have to relieve the babysitter until 8:15, so I think you might want to start that going. Okay, so accountability, right? Accountability. So we have done studies on our seismic liability for fixing bridges or buildings and so on in a few places. I was not asking about, though I appreciate getting the information about how much it would cost to do the rest of city buildings. I want to know, just back of the envelope, order of magnitude, what would it cost to replace buildings that would be damaged or destroyed? Councilor Semple is right on talking about the Fleet building. That is a big deal in the event of a quake. That building will not take a magnitude 9 quake to fall over. That building will take an 8-year-old on a bike running into it to fall over. And so we know that that's coming down in the event of a Cascadia quake. But we probably could quickly, not thoroughly, not 5 significant digits, get it exactly right, but we could quickly get a general sense of the scale of the damage to all city facilities in the event of a quake. I implore you to put that in the unfunded needs assessment. I know it doesn't feel as concrete as the estimates that you get from engineers, where they have really studied a building and found out what a seismic retrofit would cost. But we need that number. And just as scale, I want to point out you have 2 numbers in the unfunded needs assessment that are, for scale, there are a few things in here. If I can flip to it quickly. So on page, and this is Appendix B, an unfunded needs assessment, there are 2 things here. Critical bridges, seismic retrofitting, and the new fleet facility. Those are $34 million and $25 million, respectively. These are huge, huge costs, right? Together, they dwarf even the most lavish version of City Hall that we might be considering. So that's a big deal. And then those numbers have a lot of zeros. They're probably off by 10% or 15%, but who cares, right? What we need is a general sense of scale. So I think having that in the unfunded needs assessment is absolutely necessary. I have more time, but I don't really. So I'm gonna leave it there.
Gotcha. Councilor Clark.
Thank you. Josh and I are singing similar tunes tonight. I don't know entirely what to make of that, but I thought I'd throw it out there. Number one, I agree 11 on a scale of 1 to 10 with John and Emily and with, several people have said about the level of public safety need we have versus where we are in this budget. Now, I recognize full well that we have a wonderful new chief, and it's going to take him a little time to get acclimated, have a get all the sense of the outcomes we're looking for, and have his strategic plan for how we're going to do that along with the executive team. And I get that's going to drive a different number, 2-3 months, whatever the time from now than it is now. But I still think we ought to be looking at preparing for that in a budget, because I agree it's certainly one of the community's largest needs, most glaring needs. And I don't think, I think many of the things proposed in the budget are wonderful and things we should do, but on a comparative scale, I agree. I don't want to see us coming out asking for more money later when we could be doing it right now. Number two, I don't want to push back. I think a 9% recidivism rate is awesome. That's great. With the community court program, that's something to crow about. That's a success. But it's the success of that program within its own framework, within its own statistics, and that's important. But that program was created in order to address a serious problem. And the serious problem was how we deal with some significant public safety problems in our downtown. And there's a disconnect here of a little bit that I want to be really careful of. I would say that we're hearing a lot, and we continue to hear a lot from folks who spend most of their day downtown, that they don't feel as though there's a significant improvement, that the very small recidivism rate would indicate. They still see it as a very large-scale problem. So I don't want to say, oh, look, we've got a very low recidivism rate, so it's obviously working. We don't need to do anything else. We obviously still have a glaring need with downtown public safety, even though this program is working well. And I think the budget should reflect that. And then lastly, to take off on what Josh was saying, I was in a neighborhood meeting a couple nights ago, and resiliency and preparedness for a Cascadia earthquake was a huge topic there. And we used to, years and years ago, as a matter of policy on council, create comprehensive plans for some goal, right? I think we need a comprehensive plan for resiliency to that. I really do. That covers more than just a building's cost to replace, but our response.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to be extremely repetitive, but that's because I think it's extremely important. A while ago, we were talking about the police, and I was told we need 12 officers. So 2 officers over hire just isn't enough for me. I'm the downtown counselor, and it is just relentless, the need. And I know we're going to have a session about public safety in downtown, and what I would like to know is, what else can we do? What of these unfunded needs for public safety could we pull into the budget? I know it's got to be offset by something. Well, what? And I'm still shocked that this is becoming my #1 issue, that we need more police. But we do, and I'm hoping we'll have multiple strategies presented for the 911 and EPD so that we can craft a stronger response than we have right now in the budget. There's so many things that we need and that we want, but if we're not feeling safe in our city, does anything else, aside enough food and shelter, really matter? Because I think you need air, then you need water, then you need food, then you need shelter, which includes clothing, and then you need safety. And then you need health care, and then you need education. So that safety piece, I think, is more critical than we want to admit. And take it from me, that's a shock. So thank you.
Thank you.
Whenever's the right time, I'd just like to be able to provide some additional information in this conversation as we sort of move forward. So whatever's the right time on that. In response to some of the questions and comments.
Do you want to address some of them now, or do you want to wait till?
Either way, well, I guess I'll start addressing.
I missed your response, so
I'm actually really.
John, you can have the rest of my time.
Okay. You only had 47. Well, yours is unlimited, so I'm good with that. I'm actually really encouraged that people have put public safety and community justice as a high priority. That is absolutely, and if you were to talk to all the execs, we have made that a urgent, high priority for us. And so there's no doubt that that's important. From police officers, it's not 12. I think it's more than 12 is what we really do need. It's not one community court. We could really expand by 2 or 3 times of the community court. When we talk about mental and behavioral health facilities, we need all of that to a part of this. The comms center needs more capacity. The city prosecutors need more capacity. So all of that's absolutely true. So I'm really encouraged that that's a high priority. But I do want to maybe connect a couple of dots that Mike will often ask us to try to connect. One is, and I know there's questions about, well, if these are going to be ongoing costs, why don't we propose them as ongoing costs? And I would say a couple of things. One is we recognize that in some of those cases, this really represents a bridge to the much larger and more comprehensive conversation around public safety and community justice. We're not suggesting at all that this is intended to resolve any of those issues. The continue, and this is my mantra and will continue to be, the difficulty. And I don't agree with Josh that we're at the panic stage. What I do agree with is in the out years we have some significant challenges as we articulated with PERS and some of those kinds of things. And so if we want to add $2 or $3 million more of ongoing costs, absolutely. You can recommend that, the council can do that. It just makes not only the out years difficult, it actually makes this year much more difficult as far as how do you balance revenues and expenditures. And so part of what we always encourage is if you want to add ongoing costs, figure out ongoing ways for paying that, because a one-time cost just doesn't, at the end of the day, it doesn't work. It feels good for a minute and it just doesn't work. So I don't think there's absolutely any disagreement with the problem of public safety and the need for response time, the need for uncommitted time and all of that. The question is how we're going to address that. And I think what we have sort of started down the road of saying, you know, this budget, recognize it's definitely sort of a bridge trying to stop a couple of the holes that are definitely there. Make sure we have a very thoughtful, thorough conversation, comprehensive conversation about all the needs. What are the options for ongoing revenue in order to meet those needs? And over the next many months, have a very robust conversation, and hopefully as we move into the fall that the council can actually have options to move forward with some of that. So I'm really encouraged that people think of it as a priority. I would just always caution us about just automatically putting an ongoing cost that will have long-term financial implications much beyond sort of the current budget process. And when we talk about priorities, remember in our general fund, we've added $8,000 worth of ongoing costs. So it's not a trade-off with what we've added in ongoing costs into the budget that would have to be traded off. It's either current other stuff that's already in the budget or some other way of doing that. So anyhow, as we kind of go through the conversation.
Thank you. I've added myself to the queue. I have a question on slide 14 on the local marijuana taxes. Those taxes were going to be to fund 3 different items that were mentioned. One of them was park security. What does that look like to the public? Is that police officers? Is that overtime for police officers? Is that parks personnel? What is that?
Well, I mean, so what we've used the money for, council gave some direction to use it for all of those examples that you provided. We have used some of that money for prosecutor costs. We have used some of that money for downtown and park security. So it's really, it could be in a form. I can't tell you exactly where every single dollar. We've been cobbling together a lot of different resources to address downtown public safety issues as well as parks and rec or park safety issues. And so some of those dollars have gone to help support costs related to officers. Some of it has gone to supporting the community court. Some of it has gone to supporting prosecution services too. Does that answer your question, Scott?
It does.
Yeah.
That's what I was thinking.
It's a package of things that we're trying to use to cobble together resources to keep these things moving forward.
In regard to community court, we've had that now for almost a year, has it been? Or is
It'll be almost 2 years. It'll be 2 years in September, which is the end of, we received a 2-year grant for community court. And one of the big things that they really stressed is make sure that as you near the end of that 2-year period, that is the time to really start looking at your data, because it needs a little bit of time in order to really see the long-term benefit of the program and what's happening. And so we're nearing the end of that period, which will happen in September, and there's funding to maintain that program through that period and beyond for the next year to make sure that we get more experience and we don't have a break in service while council and others get a chance to weigh in on the effectiveness of that program and the benefits to the community.
So do we have that data now that we're able to share out?
We'll be starting to work on that over the summer, yeah. There's incremental data that we have, as John referenced, with lowering the recidivism rate. We know that the numbers of people attending and moving into community court are extremely high. Judge Allen spoke with us a couple of weeks ago, and on a Friday in this space, they had 65 people. They had all the different service providers. I mean, the need and demand for the services, and I think about it as sort of a wraparound program in that people can address the issues that they have related to criminal activity or behavior, but more importantly, they're having direct access to services that's getting them into housing, that's getting them into treatment, and that's what's changing the trajectory. And so you have people that have long history in engaging with the police department and having a number of arrests, and then just on this cycle where they're failing to appear when they get released from jail, or they're failing to comply with the other requirements of their sentence. This program is helping people. It's that bridge to helping them return to a more productive life. So.
And I think those figures that you just gave, the 65, for instance, are good figures for us to talk about in our deliberations. So I'd like to see some of those figures that we have offhand. I know that it may not be comprehensive, but it does serve as a basis to find out the investment that we're making. Is it good? Is our program good? I know in general terms they're very good programs, and I'm familiar with them from other areas. But do we need more money to make ours better? Where do we sit in those areas? Almost 2 years worth of data. I think it would be beneficial to have that. That exhausts the queue. Are there any round?
Chris?
Josh?
Thank you. Interesting conversation. I try to look for a theme in the Budget Committee meetings, and maybe this year's is back to the core. Talking about what the core is. And public safety is obviously one of the discussions we want to have around what is the core. But the core can get large very quickly. Somebody might say, the core is police and fire, that's the core. And someone else might say, well, it's police and fire and streets, that's the core. And someone else might say, well, it's police, fire, streets, and parks, that's the core. And so you're going to get a different definition of what the core is. And that requires a lot of study and a lot of thought. I think there are certain things that we would all agree are in the core, but I think there's also individual people who would say, I want to put this in the core. So that can become a circular conversation. The other part is, if you do go back to the core, you're consciously saying, we're going to emphasize and put more money into the core, but it's going to have to come from somewhere. Because you've already told us that that's what your budget is. And if this group wants to recommend going back to the core and creating more funding within the core, what will we be taking money away from? Because that's what we'll be doing. And the question then is that a budget committee question, or is that a city council question? When you start talking about what do you take money away from, because that now gets into the issue of priorities and policies. And I don't have a clear answer for that. There's also an aspect to it, which is long-term versus immediate, chronic versus acute. You talk about ongoing money and one-time money. There's also long-term and short-term. And in the area of public safety, I think there is a long-term need we're trying to accomplish, and I think ongoing money is one of the elements we want to utilize for that and be strategic about how we do it. But I have a sense that there are some immediate acute problems right now The weather is getting warmer, and I'm seeing a problem that's growing today. Not in 2 years when we've trained a newly hired police officer, it's now. And so I'm thinking in terms of acute, and that means I might be willing to ask for some one-time money to deal with an immediate acute problem, knowing it's not going to be ongoing, it's not going to be long-term. But I sense that there is some acute problems right now that a long-term solution are not going to deal with immediately. And so I think we need to look at that balance as well. The long-term ongoing part of the core, but also I think there's a acute aspect for the core. And finally, on the community court, I think is very effective. It's a great bang for the buck, because if somebody doesn't keep going into jail beds that we pay for over and over and over again, then you're saving a ton of money. And if the recidivism rate is as low as it is, you're saving a ton of money on a jail bed that doesn't have to just keep being reoccupied and reoccupied, and you're getting somebody out of that system, which the judge will be the first one to tell you. The revolving door of just citing him, putting him in jail, letting him out, citing him, putting him in jail, letting him out is not a cost-effective solution.
Thank you. Josh?
Hi. So I think along those lines, one of the things I would be interested in hearing a little bit more about, and again, going back to the one-time versus ongoing, is there's a section here about prior years limited duration funding being removed. And some of that is pretty clearly things that, like, okay, we bought it, it's done, right? But I know, for example, one of the things that's listed in here is the downtown and urban parks improvements. And I know that was some of the things that we're looking at, the public safety issues downtown, trying to have programming, trying to look at cleanliness and security, and really having clarity. Does that mean that those types of operational things like just aren't going to happen this summer if that's not in the budget, if that funding's being removed? And so I think a little bit more understanding about what are these things that are being discontinued that were one-time funding would be helpful. And
we'll have to cut back to you on that.
Yeah, and I know that some of them it's like, oh, and this part's included here and there, but
right.
Josh.
There are others. I didn't want to round 5 for me. So
I know.
Yeah, go ahead.
So this is a little separate, so I don't want to totally interrupt the flow. But I have some questions about spending down the reserve fund. Between panic and not panic and wherever we're ending up, I personally panic if my savings account disappears, and I know it's going to disappear in the next few years. It's kind of like leaving a job without, having one to follow up with. And so it really concerns me that we haven't looked a little bit more at when do we start, will we start making cuts, and at what point do we start making cuts? And I'd like to hear a little bit more as we go. It seems like we're making an assumption that the reserve fund should and will be spent down. Have I completely misinterpreted that sort of assumption?
I think your observation is exactly right. What history would tell us is that, and so from last year to this year is a good example of that. When we left last year, we were anticipating a couple of $1 million worth of gap to be able to start closing this year and next year. Things just fluctuated, revenues changed, expenditures changed, and what we saw was, based on all of that, actually that gap wasn't there anymore. And so that's part of what we are extremely conscious of, the out years, and don't want to get into a position where we're just spending and focusing everything in this year just to creating bigger problems in the out years. But we also don't want to just overcorrect, because if last year, if we would have just overcorrected and eliminated $2 million worth of things, we actually eliminated $1 million last year, but if we would have eliminated an additional $2 million, what we would have found is we would have overcorrected. And so part of what we try to do with the reserves is provide that cushion to be able to do that. We do set a target of 8%, which is generally a best practice in the industry. And so when we have more than 8%, it doesn't mean we have to spend it down for sure, but we're more comfortable spending that down in order to maintain sort of consistency out into the future. I don't know if that helps, but our history has been over the last 10 years that we monitor for sure the out years. We're very conscious of the near term, and then give ourselves the ability to continually to adapt to changing financial situations.
Yeah, that definitely helps. I get nervous when I see an optimistic and a conservative spending trend, and that that gap that we will start using it. So it's good to hear kind of the logic behind that. Thanks.
I just had a couple relatively quick things. One is to push back a little bit on the one-time money. Is yes, it's one-time money and it's spending, but we need to make sure we're being honest when we're using one-time money for increased costs on jail beds or the ALS ambulance or whatever it is, a couple personnel here and there, that we are recognizing that next year we may be laying those people off, or we may not have those jail beds, or that it's too easy to call it one-time funds every single year, when the reality is if we don't have the funds to pay for the increased cost of the jail beds, then we need to recognize that that's just not a renewed one-time cost. That really is a cut. And so I don't have a problem calling that an ongoing expense, because that's really what it is. We're looking at a cut in service if we don't renew our one-time expenses.
I don't disagree with that at all. The jails is a great example where, and community court's the same example. We know that it needs to be sustainable funding into the future, and so as part of that whole community justice conversation, it has to include how we're going to sustain those funding. So I don't disagree with that at all. I think what we really don't try to do is hire people that then have to get laid off if we're using one-time funds. And so we're very conscious about that. So I don't disagree with your wanting to be very open that these are costs that need to get accounted for into the future. Our suggested strategy is do that in the context of this public safety, community justice conversation.
And then I'm not sure if I'm agreeing or disagreeing with Chris, but the question of priorities, I think, is a budget committee conversation. Ultimately, we make a recommendation and you're going to do as you wish, but as a budget committee, it is our role to say, we have the money for 14 new public works positions. I think it's better to hire 12 new police officers, and maybe it's 12 or maybe it's 20 who knows what the final number ultimately comes from the chief once he's done all the evaluation, but at least we're making a good faith effort and we're saying, we want 12 police officers and 2 public works, rather than the other way around. And that is a question of priorities that I do think is absolutely appropriate in this body to discuss. And if you decide otherwise in your sessions, and so be it. But the nature of the community members is to provide that voice to council that the public safety is a passion that at least a few of us have. That's it.
Josh.
Great, thank you, and great comments from everybody. I really appreciate it. A quick point about this last one, really piggybacking on what Emily brought up and John, your response, and then I want to talk about the climate recovery ordinance briefly. So John, you said if we had done, say, $2 million, a $2 million reduction in ongoing costs instead of $1 million, that would have been an overcorrection. I just want to say I don't think that's necessarily the case. We wouldn't have been in deficit, but if we're looking at an obvious need for structural adjustment in our budget, you have pointed out in a variety of ways over years that it's easier to make smaller, more gradual changes rather than to wait until that time and make a really big change. So I don't know, maybe $2 million starting last year would have been great going forward, just considering the pain we're going to feel in the mid-2020s. So I hope we keep this discussion alive. I think we will need to, but I think it's a critically important one because we definitely don't want to wait. I probably shouldn't have used the word panic, but definitely thinking about structural change rather than just putting it off. On the climate recovery ordinance, so many of you, I think, know that I spend a lot of my time professionally on climate action and sustainability in a business setting, and I appreciate the discussion of core services. I think part of our job is to worry about things other than the most pressing needs right now. We have to cover certain things right now. Councilor Semple's comments about basic needs are apropos here, but we also have a job to think long term. And although I think it's excellent that we have this city focus section on the CRO and also this categorization in the UNA, in the unfunded needs assessment, I want to point out some shortcomings here. Because I think it's actually potentially misleading to community members. As you know, you've heard a lot at council, you've heard a lot of discussion about the climate recovery ordinance and about climate efforts, and I think this doesn't give a great picture, unfortunately. So first of all, in this first section of the unfunded needs assessment, climate recovery ordinance is this first one. Several of these really shouldn't be elevated to CRO categorization. Items 5, 6, and 7 are really about public buildings and infrastructure. These are all energy efficiency and cost saving measures that the city would undertake to be fiscally responsible and to do good asset management. They represent absolute decimal dust in terms of the community's whole greenhouse gas emissions. So I don't really think it's fair to put those things there. Also, the off-street shared use path, item number 4, that's Parks and Rec. It's not really climate recovery. If we're going to talk about the climate recovery ordinance, we should be talking about our transportation system, first and foremost. We should be talking about the built environment. And those are the big priorities. And for that, we need to call out policy connections that are not reinforced in this document. So I'll talk about that more another time and submit some comments. But this is missing the big pieces, and it's talking about a lot of small and medium-sized ones.
Thank you. I'd like to offer the floor to our mayor if she has any comments.
I guess I have found this conversation very enlightening. I think I share with everyone in the Budget Committee the concern that we are underfunding our public safety and those systems, and so I think that ongoing conversation about how we look at that in this larger context, immediate needs and long-term needs. But I also share this deep concern about how we're preparing for, in terms of resiliency, in terms of other events. Are we really on track to do the work that we need to do? So recognizing revenue is the big issue, and really very much appreciate the input you've all offered tonight. Very helpful.
Thank you. Take the remaining of our time to have a demo on the budget visualization tool that we just implemented. Jamie.
Get out of this presentation. Sorry, I'm having technical difficulties here. Oh, no. Well, while Maurizio troubleshoots for me, I'll just introduce myself. I'm Jamie Garner. I'm the acting budget and analysis manager, and I figured we could take a few minutes today to talk a little bit about the Eugene Open Budget website, just in case people haven't had a chance to visit it yet, and also go over some of the functionality and some of the statistics that we've seen since we launched it. So we launched the website on April 27th, the same day that we released the FY19 proposed budget. And the idea behind the website is that it's an accessible tool for people to interact more with the information that's included in our proposed budget and ultimately our adopted budgets in a way that makes sense to them, and it shows a lot of charts and graphs, and people can use it at home, and it's a lot easier to understand and access as opposed to a 200-plus page document. So since we launched it, we've seen almost 550 users visit the website, so pretty good engagement throughout the community. The average visit's around 4 minutes, so they're spending a little bit of time there.
And the vast majority of the visits are from the United States, but we've also had visits from Peru, New Zealand, and the Philippines. So people all across the world are checking out our site. Most people are just going to the website directly, typing in the URL, but many people are getting to it through the Register Guards website because they did an article on the site. Also Facebook and Twitter shares and Google searches. So a lot of different ways that people are finding out about this information. Most people are using their desktop computers. We've got about 78% of our visits from your PC, but 17% of those visits are coming from mobile devices like your phones, and another 5% from tablets. So we're seeing a broad spectrum of users and different types of ways that they're accessing that data. And at this point, we're averaging about 18 daily users. So people are coming and going. So when we talk about this website, like I said, it's reflecting the data that's included in our proposed budget. And when we developed it, we really went back and looked at a lot of other models, other people that are using this software. So City of Redmond, Washington, we visited their website a lot. We probably really propped up their statistics while we were developing it. So you're welcome, Redmond. What we ended up doing is filling in 3 different data sets, essentially. So we're looking at our revenues here in green, the City of Eugene revenues. Our expenditures are a different data set here, City of Eugene expenditures, and then the capital budget for both the URA and the City of Eugene to give folks a comprehensive idea of what's happening in the city for the capital improvement projects. And there are several different ways that you can access the data within the system. We have a couple of search boxes here where you can just type in some information and it will bring back. We've got some common questions. And this is data that's not necessarily in open budget, but it links back to data that's in the proposed budget, so it's a way to engage people with that larger document too. And then you can also click on these areas here, these boxes, to go into the data yourself. So if I wanted to find out information about police, if I type that in, you'll see I have several different options here. The blue dots here indicate it's an expenditure. It corresponds with the color down below. The green dots mean it's a revenue. So if I wanted to go to the police department, I would click on that, and I get all of the services that are included within the police department. I can also change the fiscal year to 2018, and I can see even more data because we're further along in the 2018 year here. So we've got our adopted budget is the light blue line, and then any changes that were made in the supplemental budget is overlaid with that darker blue line there. I can also change this to a pie chart and see it represented a little bit differently there. So people who prefer pie charts might like this visual representation a little bit more. So I go back to the snapshot, and as I drill down, let's say I'm interested in animal services, I can click on that, and I can get comprehensive information that's included in the budget document about their M&S and their personnel services expenditures. So that's one way, by using that search function. I can also drill down by going to this box here, Explore Revenues. So if I wanted to see all the revenues, this is all the revenues at the City of Eugene, I could change it to how's it spent, and this would tell you by fund where the revenues are. I can also change this little drop down up here, and I can see revenues by service or revenues by funds. So it really is up to the user to determine how they want to interact with the data. If I clicked on perhaps charges for services, that's our big revenue category here. You'll see all of these services are then broken down by revenue category, which is a little bit more granular look at that. And then let's say I wanted to see parking revenue. If I click on that, I see the parking revenue brought in by service. So we see parking, of course, brings in parking revenue. Airport, there's some cultural services parking revenue. So a really in-depth look at what our revenues look like. And if I go back to this home page, I want to just take a moment to highlight the capital budget. We think this is an area that people are really going to be interested in. And it has a little bit more information than some of the other areas. We really go in depth on the projects that are slated in the FY19 proposed capital budget. So you can see here there's an interactive map where these blue markers are. These are specific projects that are happening in this area. And then these green circles with numbers in them, those are multiple projects happening within that area. So I can click on one of those multiple projects, and then it breaks out into the individual projects. And then I can click on something, so Roosevelt Boulevard Path Extension, And that takes me to in-depth information about exactly what this project is, and it also provides a reference to the page number in the CIP and a link to the CIP. And if you scroll down a little bit, you get, again, see that map to see exactly where this project is expected to take place. And then you also have the funds that are funding this particular project. So in this case, it's the Road General Capital Projects Fund and the Transportation System Development Charges Fund. So both of those are going into this particular project. So it's a fairly robust system designed with the end user experience in mind. And we hope that people are finding it useful. Hopefully it's engaging more people in the budget and the policy making process. But we're interested in hearing feedback and how people's experiences have gone with it too. So I'd open the floor to questions at this point.
Yeah, I just have a clarifying question. I dug deep in a few places and got to some of the backup information, the sort of in-depth information that you just showed an example of, had links to city documents, which is fantastic. I actually hadn't found that previously on Redmond's website, so you one-upped them, I think, but in a really helpful way, because the city has a lot of stuff and it's often a lot of information disclosed, but it's very difficult to connect it to the budget sometimes, so kudos for that. I also found dead ends where I thought there might be some of that in-depth information. Can you just say a little bit about, just characterize where there is in-depth information and where there isn't, so when people ask about it, we know what to say?
Sure, sure. So a lot of the data is still at a higher level. It doesn't go down to the absolute bottom level of the data that we record at, because that's a lot of financial information and probably overwhelming for most people that aren't necessarily finance professionals. So the data that we use, we really modeled it off of Redmond's website, and they essentially include the data that's included in their budget documents. So this is really modeled off of the budget documents. So when we look at expenditures, it's the corollary would be like the department view within the proposed budget document, but then we also translate it over into services to make that crosswalk for people who may identify more with services. But we go down to personnel, M&S, and capital outlay and department operating budgets, just like we do in the department view. And then on the revenue side, we get a little bit more granular because that's how we report out on the fund schedules. So we have a revenue type, which is a broader category that you see on fund schedules in the fund summary section. And then we go one level lower than that because a lot of those revenue pieces need a little bit more information to be more understandable, if that helps.
That helps. Thank you. Well, just tack on, are there plans to get, I think Redmond had a couple of years in there, plans to get previous budget information in there, how we'll be able to see this over time? Sometimes I know that's hard to do. But.
Yeah, it's a little bit of a challenge because this last year was a bit of a flux year for us. So you may have seen within the proposed budget document the section on the chart of accounts changes. So what happened this last year, the chart of accounts is basically our financial structure. It's how we report out on everything. And we went to a completely new system as part of a larger project called the Corporate Renovation Project at the City of Eugene. And so what we were challenged with was mapping our historical data into that new structure. So it was a very staff labor-intensive project to map the data that we did. We mapped FY16 and FY17 actuals, FY18 adopted budget, FY18 budget as of December 31st. So all those data sets were mapped over to the new chart of accounts, but nothing before that because it takes so much time to translate thousands of lines of accounts.
But I'm sorry, did I miss it? Is that in the budget?
No, sorry, no. So we've just focused on budget numbers at this point because that was kind of the nature of the motion of the budget committee. So the actuals numbers, FY16 and FY17 actuals, those were mapped for the purpose of including them in the FY19 proposed budget because by Oregon local budget law, we have to show those 2 prior years, and we couldn't do that unless we had mapped it over.
So we will get previous years at some point or not?
So we don't have any plans to map over because it does take so much staff time to do that, and we feel like we'd like to focus those resources on the new systems and charting out the...
But I thought, and I apologize for being...
No,
But I thought you just said you had to translate it already for the previous years in order to follow budget law.
Right, so just the actuals, 16 and 17 actuals, and so we don't have actuals in this particular system because we focused on the budget side, if that makes sense. So there's a difference. Actuals is what really happened, budget is what we plan to happen.
I guess the reason I don't understand this, it sounds like you're describing congruent
Right.
congruent, like sort of shape of information and categories.
Right. There's a lot of data that exists outside of actuals that lives in the budget side, so it would require even more resources to translate the adopted budget, the proposed budget. It's just there's a significant amount of data difference between those sets, and so we made the choice to move forward with the data that we had readily available, with the idea that we'll build upon that in the future as we continue to adopt budgets and have supplemental budgets.
Great.
I think this is great. It looks like a lot of work, and we've been looking forward to seeing it. So thank you for the success, and it will be interesting to watch it as the years add up and we can go backwards. And I want to give a shout out to Josh, because he's the one that showed us the Renman site, and eventually I did follow the link and go look at it, and I was very enthusiastic. So I think this is something that will benefit anybody who has the desire to actually look at it, and thank you for finding that and sharing it.
Any other questions concerning the tool?
I do have one more. Well, let me see what other people do. Sorry.
Councilor Clark?
No, I was. Nope, not me.
Just a final comment. A couple of things. It's always sort of like a nice and not so nice sandwich. So let me do the nice part first. I really appreciate staff work. I mean, it's tremendous work. I understand this was not just like handing a CD-ROM to Socrata and having them sort of whip it out in a few days and you wrote a check. I mean, there was real work that went into this, and I really appreciate it. I'll say something in a moment about the scale of the visitors that we've had already. But I do want to say I think it's a little misleading in the budget message to include this website as an example of the city's transparency without mentioning where it originated. As an analogy, let me talk about a recent conversation with my 8-year-old. The other day, she told me proudly, "Hey, I cleaned my room." And she was acting proud, but I was not impressed because I had asked her repeatedly to clean her room. And in fact, I had required that she clean her room. And then she did it. And so she actually came and bragged to me with a sense of irony. The budget message has less of a sense of irony than my 8-year-old, unfortunately, here, because this was something that originated here, right? So let me give a different history. I introduced a motion for this. I appreciate the acknowledgement very much, Councilor Semple. I actually organized an online petition and got more than 100 responses in support of this, which was more than all budget committee testimony that I've seen in my 4+ years here. And then most important, you all, the budget committee, voted to fund this, to recommend to council, and council approved it. So this is an example of the commitment to transparency and accountability by the budget committee and by the city council. I think it's important to be clear, and I want to give councilors credit for that, and I want to give the budget committee credit for that. The city gets credit for implementation, but not for origination, and this is important. So I suggest you change the budget message. I have some replacement language here to offer. Consistent with the city government's commitment to transparency, staff have implemented the budget transparency tool as directed by the budget committee and approved by council. Let's just be clear about where that came from. That said, it is consistent with other transparency efforts that I really appreciate. I think, John, you rightly called out the bond measure and how voters reapproved that, in large part, I think, for exactly the reasons you talked about. But we need to be really clear at this moment in time in particular about where the efforts for transparency are coming from, and I think we should be as honest and as specific with the community as possible on those points. Thank you.
Timing, brother.
Any other questions, comments? Thank you, Jamie.
All right, thank you.
Okay, that brings us to our next steps. So we have 3 meetings, May 16th, 23rd, and the 30th. We'll have an opportunity for public testimony at each of those meetings. Just a reminder of the email that went out. You can send questions, signal intent but we won't entertain motions until around the 23rd, 24th of May, and then staff will help us organize those in a logical fashion so that we can proceed on the next few meetings to finish. Also a reminder, there are council workshops, and there's multiple ways to watch those, either in person or on the web cams, or the recordings later on May 14th and 16th. Those work sessions go hand in hand with some of the presentations that we'll be having over the next 3 weeks, and so I think that's a great use of your time, and so I encourage you to watch those. Last questions, comments? There are none. We're adjourned. Thanks.